is currently Rostermania in the Valorant universe, and naturally that means that there is a lot of crazy shit going on. And obviously with teams blowing up, reformulating, you're always gonna have those teams who are trying to be the super team of their region. Today, I want to talk about two of the organizations in the Americas League who are trying to build a super team, and whether or not I think they're going to succeed, and who I think is going to be the bigger super team. And these organizations are CLOUD9 and NRG. Now, by the time this video comes out, I really hope this information isn't out of date, but I'm using a lot of my sources from George Geddes reporting for .esports. He's been doing an amazing Rostermania tracker, so I just want to put credit out there. I do not have inside sources. I'm using this information. So one of the really important things about these two organizations and why they are in really hot contention for the super team of the Americas League is because they are taking apart this amazing OpTic roster, which is no longer going to be able to play as a full team. And the question is how much value are each going to get from those sides, and what are they going to combine them with in order to finish off these rosters? So CLOUD9 is the organization of these two when news came out about them first in terms of what they were doing with the OpTic roster, and that is that they were signing Yay. And judging by reporting at the time of recording, that process is in the late stages but has not yet been finally confirmed. Now, CLOUD9 are an interesting one because they were a really successful roster at the beginning of the year and during Champions, and then we of course had a roster swap with them where Zeta left the team and they brought in Curry, and it just kind of felt like after that there wasn't really it just didn't work anymore. But that didn't stop the fact that CLOUD9 still had these really incredible players on their roster, and they are continuing to build around those players as far as we can tell. So Vanity, their IGL, will be remaining. Zeppa, it looks like it's going to be remaining, and Leaf too. So on top of that, signing Yay. Now, first up, this is a very interesting thing to think about because Yay and Leaf have quite overlapping roles. Who is going to be doing what? Is it that one of them is going to be expected to change roles, or is it that Leaf, for example, is going to be expected to take the six-man role of the roster, and that Yay is going to be their kind of starter duelist slash chamber, assuming he's still in the meta? I think this is an interesting thing to consider, of course, because it changes what we would expect for who is going to fill those other slots on CLOUD9. I'm very happy to see Vanity and Zeppa be retained in the roster. Zeppa, I've said this so many times publicly, but he is my favorite player in Valorant. I just absolutely adore watching him. And Vanity is an incredible IGL and has done so much for the team. So I think they're a really solid core around which to build, and bringing in Yay, I mean, he's Yay. My assumption is that Yay is going to be used as that primary entry and that Leaf will be the sixth man. I can't imagine Leaf changing roles, but I suppose there's always the chance that he could. It could end up being situational, but that said, like in the rules for Valorant, as far as I'm aware, you have to announce the rosters that you intend to play your maps with 24 hours in advance. So it's not like you can just kind of situationally sub people in and out like you could in Overwatch. Now, because Yay takes on this role where, yes, he plays a lot of chamber, but he is first and foremost a duelist, I don't expect Yay to be playing Sentinel. I don't think he'll take this more strict Sentinel role. Now, for a lot of 2022, we haven't needed a strict Sentinel role because the meta just hasn't led that way. However, I think that is going to become more pertinent going forward into 2023. We've already seen Cypher start to come back into some games a little bit more, but also I think it's just incredibly risky to base an entire roster around this idea that, oh, don't worry, we won't need a Sentinel, we've got a chamber player. So I think they'll still be looking for a Sentinel player, or perhaps more accurately, they may be looking for someone who has a very flexible playstyle where they can switch between roles to play around whatever it is that Yay is going to be expected to do in that map, whether he's going to be taking on chamber or whether he's going to be going back to playing Jet. So who do you look for if you want someone really flexible? Well, I know a great player who could do that. How about Zelsis? Zelsis is apparently the next person that CLOUD9 have announced that they're going to be signing. This is a huge pickup, not just because of his flexibility and the way that he'd be able to play around those role switches, but also because Zelsis was formerly a teammate of Vanity, who of course is the IGL for CLOUD9. They were together on version 1, so they have that determined genuine synergy that's not going to have to be built. And Zelsis is a highly valued player. He spent some time on Sentinels in the last stage. Prior to that, he was on version 1 still, and he's always been seen as a hot commodity, and I think that he is a really good pickup for Cloud9. Now, I think the really important thing about Cloud9 is that these players around whom they seem to be building are players who are not highly resource dependent players, in my opinion anyway. I think that if you were to look at certain players that are on the market, they are players who require being played around a little bit more. And this is what kind of gives me some faith in this idea of Cloud9 building a super team, because I think that if you... I think the big problem with super teams that usually happens is that you build around the fact that you have these players with insane skill, and independently in a vacuum they're amazing, but they are not greater than the sum of their parts when you put them together. Because to succeed as a team, you don't just have to all be absolute like insane gods. You have to work well together. And often what happens is when you have players who are really independently good, it's because they've played in teams where they are willing to funnel all their resources into that player. And that player requires a lot in order to be enabled to be really good. However, I think when you look at players like Ye and like Zelsis, they are not that player. They're not players who are going to require all 4 other players in the team to put everything into them, and they can kind of operate independently. Being able to operate independently means that the team should be able to change where their focus is and have a lot of flexibility in that. And it means that they're not going to be rigidly, stuck in some certain way of playing. And they're also probably not going to have ego wars. And that's another really big problem. Instead, different players should be able to be left to their own devices and under the, the guidance of vanity, be able to make contextual decisions about what it is they want to do. And with these blurred lines in the roles, it looks like Cloud9 are sort of setting themselves up to be a pretty flexible team. And I think that if you're building a super team, that is the best you can hope for, so that you don't fall into that rut that every other fucking super team in the history of esports seems to have fallen into, which is that you just fall flat on your face. It's okay. Now, when we look over at NRG, it's been reported that they are interested in signing the main core of the OpTic roster, and this would be FNS, Victor, Crashies, and the coach Chet. So Marved hasn't been included in this. I don't know if that means that Marved is being picked up somewhere else, or if it's whatever's going on there, but FNS, Victor, Crashies as the players. So this is an interesting one, actually. I just want to point out, because Victor and Crashies were both unrestricted free agents leaving OpTic, and there was a lot of speculation that maybe they wouldn't actually find a roster purely because they were advertising themselves as a duo, and that's a lot harder to pick up because that's not necessarily going to be what these organizations are looking for. Clearly NRG don't feel that way. For me, I think that FNS is such a valuable pickup for this, because I just think FNS is an incredible IGL, and any team that was going to pick him up was going to have something really huge. But the fact he now has these pre-synergized relationships with Crashies and Victor as well is probably good. There are ups and downs to that, though. When I was on Valoranting talking about this the other day, one point that was brought up by Juvenile, which I thought was really interesting, is that if you go back to the Overwatch League and you look at the really big successful Western teams, not even just Western teams, you look at the really big successful teams from before the Overwatch League was instated, you had teams like Envy, for example, who then became the Dallas Fuel, and the Dallas Fuel were never a great team, even though they were phenomenal when they were Envy, and it was the same roster. You also had teams like Lunatic High was his other example, who were incredible when they were Lunatic High, but never found that same level of success as the Seoul Dynasty. This is an interesting thing, because the question is, okay, well, we have this proven roster, like, why wouldn't they necessarily succeed? Well, in this instance, it's going to be interesting because you have 3 players from this roster who have played in a roster that hasn't changed for over a year now. So they're gonna have to get used to being around other people who aren't necessarily innately acquainted with the way that that team is run. By this point in time, OpTic and those players on OpTic are gonna just know how they like to work. It's not something that they would necessarily have to communicate. And that's something that these players are going to have to roll back a little bit to kind of indulge those new players into. That said, I do think it really helps that they would be keeping the same coach, because the coach can kind of be that conduit between the direction for the team and the way that it's actually implemented in the team. And so the philosophies behind the way that OpTic play are still going to be present. They're not going to be forced under somebody else's way of looking at the game, which could maybe change the dynamic between the players or the success that they find between each other. So I think that's a good thing that Chet will still be there, but I am super interested to see how they would do in inducting other players into that environment that up until this point has been a closed bubble for so long. Now, of course, one of the big questions about this is going to be, how are they going to fare without their playmaker? To a lot of people, OpTic were as successful as they were because of Ye. Ye was that guy. I don't think that it was quite as bad as the team lived and died by Ye, but I could definitely see why people would argue that he was such an important factor in their success. If you have a look at pre-Ye Envy, so when the team existed without Ye on it, they never broke past 4th place in NA challenges. So they never quite found that success that they then did when Ye was there. So I think it's going to be really important for NRG to find that playmaker who, once again, kind of similarly to what I described with Cloud9, it's got to be someone who is not super resource intensive. So for example, they could bring in TenZ, and I don't think it will work very well because TenZ as an entry, as a duelist, he requires a lot. And that's, in my opinion, where a lot of Sentinels fell apart, because they weren't setting TenZ up in the way that he needed to be to find success. I don't think that you can put someone like that with this roster. For me, I'd be curious to see if they would look at somebody like Baby Bay from FaZe Clan potentially, because I mean, this is another example of a roster who a lot of people claimed lived and died by that playmaker. And it's not because the other people in the team were bad, but it's because Baby Bay was so exceptional in the way that he played. And I think that Baby Bay is good at being an independent duelist and being able to find value without relying on really heavy resource input from the rest of the team. And that just plays into the way that these players in this core have found success. So I think he would be an example of someone who would maybe be worth looking at, but you know, not necessarily an exhaustive list. I would also be really interested regarding finding someone to take Marv's role, because a lot of IGLs play controllers, and this was an example of a team where that wasn't necessarily the case. So Marv was taking on that controller role without being the IGL. So do they look for a really solid NA controller who would then have to forego being an IGL, or would they try and get somebody to role swap? Because I think a lot of the controller players, or the good controller players that you're looking at in North America at least, will have come from an IGL sort of experience. Like, this is a whole other economy where it's like, okay, IGLs are really valuable and probably worth a lot of money, but with only 5 North American teams, like, what's the likelihood you're going to be picked up as an IGL, you know? So there's probably that balance in there too. For me, I think right now of these two teams, the one that I have more faith in, or I'm more excited about, is Cloud9, because I think their selection of players that they have right now seems smart, and it actually seems pretty apt for the roles that they need. Whereas obviously with NRG, there's still stuff we need to learn. We know they've picked up a chunk of OpTic. We don't really know what's being put with that. So it's impossible to say whether it's going to mesh properly or whether it's going to be a disaster. And of course, you never know, we could get to the league next year and neither of these teams do particularly well. But I'm curious about you guys' opinion. Are you excited for Cloud9 or NRG? And who would you add to fill up the rosters in the spots that we currently don't know about? Let me know down below, because I swear I'm usually quite bad at theory crafting rosters during Rostermania. I usually try to avoid it, but this feels too big to avoid. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye. Oh, now I need to come up with an end screen. Watch one of my other videos. This is a very unoriginal end screen.